Stella had been walking through the metal corridors of New Terra for 3 full days without stopping. Her silver eyes reflected the artificial lights as she moved through the massive space station, watching the humans go about their daily lives. Most of them did not notice her. Those who did quickly looked away, unsettled by her pointed ears and the strange power that seemed to radiate from her small frame. The space station was enormous, a floating city that held over 2 million humans. Stella could feel their fear in the air, a thick and suffocating presence that had grown stronger with each passing day. They did not understand what was happening in the outer regions of space. They did not comprehend the danger that was approaching their world. Stella stopped at a viewing window and looked out at the vast darkness beyond. Somewhere out there in the depths of space, the Void Eaters were gathering. She had been fleeing from them for almost 2 years now. Every world she had tried to settle on, every civilization she had attempted to warn, had dismissed her warnings or tried to capture her for study. Humans were different, though. They were brutal and unpredictable, yes, but they were also adaptable in ways that most species were not. Behind her, she could hear the soft sounds of her 2 companions. Zephyr and Ember were resting in the private chamber she had been granted. They were massive creatures, with scales that shimmered between dark blue and purple, and wings that could span the length of a city block when fully extended. The humans had been fascinated and terrified by the dragons in equal measure. But Stella had managed to convince the station commander that they meant no harm. Her name was Morgan Hayes, and she was one of the few humans who seemed willing to listen to Stella without immediate prejudice. Morgan was tall for a human with dark skin and intelligent eyes that suggested she had seen more of the universe than most of her kind. She had served in the human military for 30 years and had risen to command the largest space station in the known human territories. Stella made her way through the corridors toward Morgan's office. The guards at the entrance recognized her now and stepped aside without challenge. Inside, Morgan was studying holographic displays that showed star charts and ship movements throughout the region. Morgan looked up as Stella entered. She did not stand or make any of the formal gestures that many humans used with creatures they feared. Instead, she simply gestured toward the empty seat across from her desk. "You look troubled," Morgan said, her voice steady and calm. More troubled than usual, Stella moved to the seat and lowered herself gracefully. She had learned to mimic human body language well enough to make most beings comfortable around her, though her movements always retained an otherworldly quality that betrayed her alien nature. "I have been receiving signals," Stella said, "old signals from other survivors of my people. There are more elves out there than I thought, but the signals are getting weaker. That means only one thing. The Void Eaters are drawing closer to them." Morgan leaned back in her chair and clasped her hands together thoughtfully. "How long do we have? Before they reach human space?" 30 to 40 days, perhaps a few days more," Stella replied. "It depends on which route they choose through the wormholes. But they will come. They always come. They are not like other predators in space. They do not hunt for food or resources. They hunt because it is their nature. They consume civilizations and leave nothing behind but empty worlds. And you want me to prepare my people for war?" Morgan said. It was not a question. "I want you to prepare your people for survival," Stella corrected. "War implies 2 sides with a reasonable chance of victory. What is coming will not be a war. It will be an extinction event, unless you are willing to do something that your people have never done before." Morgan's expression grew curious. "What would that be?" "You must accept help from the outside," Stella said. "You must lower your defenses and trust a species you do not fully understand. You must learn to work with beings who see the universe very differently than you do. Most humans would rather die than do this." Morgan stood and walked to the window where Stella had been standing moments before. She gazed out at the darkness of space, and Stella could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. Morgan was a pragmatist. She did not have time for pride or prejudice. She had a station full of people to protect. "What exactly are you proposing?" Morgan asked. Stella stood and moved beside her. "I can teach your military commanders tactics that have worked against the Void Eaters before. I can help you design weapons that will be more effective against their ships. I can introduce you to other survivors from my world and from other worlds that have faced this threat. And my dragons can fight alongside your forces. They are not the most powerful weapons, but they are faster and more intelligent than anything your pilots have ever encountered." "And in return?" Morgan asked. In return, you give me and my kind asylum, Stella said simply. You accept that we are not invaders or threats. You allow us to rebuild our civilization within human space. You give us a home. Morgan turned to face Stella directly. For a long moment, the two women simply looked at each other. Then Morgan extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement. There will be resistance, Morgan said. The Council will not approve this easily. There are politicians and generals who will argue that your kind is too dangerous to trust. I know, Stella replied, taking Morgan's hand. Her grip was gentle but conveyed surprising strength. But you are not asking for their approval. You are informing them of a decision that has already been made. You have the authority to do this. I have read your military regulations. Morgan smiled slightly. You have been studying our systems. Very carefully, Stella admitted. I have learned that the most effective way to communicate with your species is not through logic alone. You respond to displays of power and confidence. I intend to give you both. Over the next 3 days, Stella worked with Morgan and her staff to develop a preliminary defense strategy. She showed them schematics for weapons that could be adapted from human technology. She explained the movement patterns of Void Eater ships and how to predict their attack formations. The human engineers were skeptical at first, but they began to see the genius in her plans. What seemed impossible became merely difficult. What seemed like certain defeat became a potential stalemate that could turn into victory. On the 4th day, Morgan called a full assembly of the station's leadership. Military commanders, politicians, scientists, and administrators filled the great conference room. Morgan stood before them and explained what would happen in the coming weeks. She spoke of the threat that was approaching, and of the alliance that she was forming with Stella and her people. The reactions were mixed. Some leaders stood and shouted their disapproval. Others listened quietly, processing the information. One general named Paul Harrison stood and demanded that Stella be arrested immediately. It was then that Stella stood as well. She did not speak, but simply raised her hand. In that moment, a holographic display materialized above the conference table. It showed the approaching fleet of Void Eater ships. The image was so detailed and so terrifying that the room fell silent immediately. Stella spoke then, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. Your choice is simple. You can deny what you see and cling to your pride. You can reject my offer and face the darkness alone, or you can choose to survive. There is no other option available to you. The silence that followed was absolute. Stella waited, letting the humans process her words. She knew that they would choose to survive. It was their nature. It was what had allowed their species to spread across so many worlds despite being weaker than so many other civilizations. Finally, Morgan stood and turned to face the assembly. We prepare for war, she said. We welcome our new allies, and we show the universe what humanity is truly capable of. The hall erupted in noise, some cheering, some still protesting. But Stella knew that the decision had been made. The alliance was beginning. The real work would now begin. The training grounds of New Terra had never seen anything like what was happening now. Stella stood on the raised platform, watching as 300 human soldiers attempted to move through the combat sequences she had taught them. They were clumsy and slow compared to what she was used to seeing from her own people, but they were determined. That was something that transcended species. A young human officer named Kevin approached Stella with a data pad showing casualty projections for the upcoming battle. The numbers were grim. Even with the best preparations, human losses would be catastrophic. The computers estimated that at least 50% of the defending forces would be killed in the first wave of attacks alone. Stella studied the projections without expression, though inside her mind was racing through calculations and contingencies. She had seen these numbers before on many worlds in many civilizations. The mathematics of war against the Void Eaters were always the same. Most defenders did not survive the first contact. These numbers are accurate, Stella said, handing the data pad back to Kevin. But they assume that we will fight using traditional tactics. We will not, Kevin looked confused. What other choice do we have? We can read their attack patterns. We can position our defenses optimally, but they will still outnumber us by a factor of 50 to 1. Stella gestured for him to follow her to a private chamber. Once they were alone, she pulled up a new holographic display. This one showed the interior structure of a Void Eater battleship, rendered in perfect detail. I was inside one of these ships, Stella said quietly. when my people made our last stand against them. I lived through the destruction of entire cities. I saw weapons that vaporized mountains. I also learned their weaknesses. She highlighted certain sections of the ship. Here, here, and here. These are the nerve centers of their control systems. If you can strike these points simultaneously on multiple ships, you can disable entire squadrons. The Void Eaters are not individually intelligent. They are controlled from larger mothership vessels. Destroy the command structure and the rest of their fleet becomes confused and ineffective. Kevin stared at the display, understanding beginning to dawn on his face. That would require precision strikes from multiple locations simultaneously. We would need perfect coordination. Our communication systems would have to be flawless. Yes, Stella said. And you will also need help from something that most military strategists overlook. You will need to involve the civilian population. Over the next 2 weeks, Stella worked with both the military and the civilian leaders of New Terra to develop an integrated defense system. Zephyr and Ember became active participants in the training process. The dragons moved through the atmosphere with stunning agility, and watching them maneuver taught the human pilots things that no computer simulation could convey. Stella spent hours working directly with Zephyr and Ember, refining their combat techniques and expanding their understanding of how to work with human fighter craft. The dragons were incredibly intelligent, far smarter than most humans realized. They could learn new tactics quickly and adapt to changing circumstances on the fly. One evening, Stella stood on the observation deck with Morgan, watching as the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and red. Morgan held a report that detailed the progress of the defense preparations. The numbers showed that they were ready as they could be. "I've been wondering something," Morgan said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Why did you choose to seek out humans? You must have known that we are not the most reliable allies. We are prone to betrayal and greed and violence." Stella smiled slightly. It was a genuine smile, something that happened rarely enough that Morgan found herself grateful to have provoked it. "Because humans are also the most adaptable species I have encountered," Stella replied. "Your history is filled with examples of your kind rising from impossible situations. You take technologies that others have created and improve upon them. You take strategies that have never worked before and somehow make them function. You see no authority as absolute. You question everything and everyone, even your own leaders. These are dangerous traits in peacetime, but in war they become tremendous strengths." Morgan nodded slowly. "There is something else I wanted to discuss with you. The Council has been asking questions about your past. They want to know more about your civilization, about how your people lived before the Void Eaters destroyed everything." Stella looked out at the sky as it continued to change colors. "My people were not so different from yours in many ways. We built cities and created art and music. We fought among ourselves sometimes over resources and beliefs. We thought we were strong enough to resist anything. We were wrong. The Void Eaters came suddenly and without warning. By the time we realized the magnitude of the threat, it was already too late. My entire family died on the day the capital city fell." Morgan placed a hand on Stella's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that transcended species barriers. "I lost my family too," Morgan said, "in a mining accident when I was young. I did not think I could survive that loss. But I did. And I made a promise to myself that I would spend my life making sure others did not have to experience that kind of pain." Stella turned to face Morgan. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Two beings from different worlds who had both suffered tremendous loss, now finding purpose and connection in their shared determination to protect others. The night before the Void Eaters arrived, Stella called for Zephyr and Ember. The two dragons came to her immediately, their movements showing a mix of excitement and wariness. They knew what was coming. Animals always sensed these things. Stella placed her hands on their scaled faces and looked into their eyes. She spoke to them in the ancient language of her people, words that predated human civilization by thousands of years. The dragons responded with low rumbling sounds and gentle movements. They were ready. As midnight approached, the communication systems on New Terra began receiving signals. The Void Eater fleet had entered human space. Their massive ships emerged from the wormholes that connected distant regions of the galaxy. The sensors lit up with thousands of contact points, each one representing a potential death sentence for millions of humans. But Stella did not feel fear. She felt something else entirely. She felt the weight of responsibility, yes, but also a strange sense of hope. She had spent so long running, so long feeling like a refugee without a home. Now finally, she had found a place to make a stand. Morgan's voice came through the communication system, calling all military personnel to their stations. The defense grid activated, flooding the skies above New Terra with sensors and weapons platforms. The human fighter craft launched from their hangars in perfect formation, and Stella stood in the command center with Morgan and Kevin and the other leaders of humanity, watching as the first moments of what would become the most important battle in human history began to unfold. The Void Eaters had no idea what they were about to face. They had conquered countless worlds and destroyed countless civilizations, but they had never encountered a species that was willing to accept outside help, to learn from beings different from themselves, and to adapt their tactics based on the strengths of their allies. The age of humanity's isolation was ending. The age of their emergence as a true player in the galactic community was beginning. The first attack came with devastating speed and overwhelming force. The Void Eater fleet emerged from behind the largest moon in the New Terra system and immediately began their assault. Massive energy beams carved through space, and the first wave of human defense satellites exploded in brilliant cascades of light. Stella watched from the command center as the battle unfolded on the massive displays before her. Zephyr and Ember were already in the sky, moving through the incoming fire with the grace and speed that only dragons possessed. Their breath weapons created paths of energy that tore through the hull armor of several Void Eater fighters, causing them to spiral out of control and crash into the atmosphere below. Kevin was coordinating the fighter squadrons with practiced efficiency. His voice came through the communication channels steady and calm, directing the human pilots toward the vulnerable points that Stella had identified in the Void Eater ships. The humans were taking casualties, but they were also inflicting damage far beyond what their numbers would suggest was possible. One of the first major victories came when a coordinated strike team of 6 human bombers, escorted by Zephyr, managed to reach the command vessel of the lead Void Eater battleship. The Dragon's breath weapon had opened a gaping hole in the ship's hull, and the human pilots flew directly into the breach, releasing their payload at point-blank range. The resulting explosion was so massive that it sent shockwaves through the surrounding fleet. Morgan turned to Stella and nodded. The first phase of their plan was working. The Void Eater attack was losing its coordination as their command structure became fragmented. Ships that should have been supporting each other were instead fighting independently, their tactics devolving into simple brute force assaults. But then something unexpected happened. A new wave of Void Eater ships emerged from a wormhole that had just opened on the opposite side of the human defensive perimeter. Stella's eyes went wide as she recognized the configuration of these new vessels. They were different from the others, older and more heavily armored. "Motherships," Stella said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "They have brought their motherships." Morgan's expression hardened. "How many?" "5, Stella replied. "Which means at least one of my people is still alive, and they have called for reinforcements." The battle intensified dramatically as the 5 motherships began their approach toward New Terra. These vessels were 5 times the size of the standard Void Eater battleships, and their firepower was proportionally greater. Where the earlier ships had been harassing the human defenses, these new arrivals seemed intent on overwhelming them completely. Stella made a decision in that moment that would change the course of the entire conflict. She turned to Morgan and said, "I am going out there." Morgan grabbed her arm. "That is suicide. Those ships are too powerful. Even your dragons cannot stand against them." "I know," Stella said. "That is why I am going to destroy them from the inside." Before Morgan could stop her, Stella activated the emergency launch system that would take her directly from the command center into a small one-person fighter craft. Within seconds, she was climbing toward the sky, leaving the safety of New Terra behind. Zephyr sensed her immediately. The bond between an elf and her dragon companion went beyond simple communication. It was almost telepathic in nature. Zephyr broke off from his current engagement and began moving toward Stella's position. Ember followed, the 2 dragons moving in perfect synchronization. Stella piloted the small craft with skill that was almost supernatural. She weaved between incoming fire from the Void Eater guns, her movement so precise and sudden that the ship's defensive systems could barely track her. Within minutes, she was approaching the closest mothership. The dragon's breath weapons were of limited effectiveness against the heavy armor of these larger vessels, but they did not need to destroy the ships completely. They just needed to create enough damage to allow Stella to penetrate the hull. The dragons worked together, their breath weapons creating a focused beam of energy that burned through the outer armor. Stella guided her small craft directly into the opening that Zephyr and Ember had created. Her fighters squeezed through with mere meters to spare on either side. Once inside, she ditched the craft and activated her personal flight suit, the ancient technology of her people responding to her mental commands. The interior of the mothership was exactly as she remembered from the nightmares that had haunted her for 2 years. The walls were covered in a strange organic material that looked almost alive. The air was thick and difficult to breathe even through her suit's advanced filters, but Stella did not hesitate. She moved through the corridors with determined purpose, following her instincts toward the control center of the ship. Along the way, she encountered several Void Eaters, creatures that looked vaguely humanoid but with features so alien and disturbing that looking at them directly caused a primal reaction of revulsion. Stella defeated them easily. She had trained for years in combat against these beings. Her blade moved with lethal precision, and each encounter ended with an enemy defeated before they could even properly comprehend that they were under attack. When she reached the command center, what she found there shocked her. Standing before the control panels was another elf, a male with silver eyes just like her own. His name was Theron, and she had believed him dead for almost 2 years. "Stella," Theron said, his voice filled with emotion that transcended years of separation. "You are alive. How are you controlling this ship?" Stella demanded, her blade still raised and ready. "I'm not controlling it," Theron replied, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "I am being controlled by it. They took me prisoner after the fall of our civilization. They have been using me to lead the hunts against the survivors of our people, but I have been searching for a way to end this. I have been waiting for someone strong enough to come and free me." Stella paused. She could sense the truth in his words through the connection that all elves shared, a spiritual link that could not be faked or hidden. Without another word, Stella moved forward and destroyed the control panels of the mothership. The systems exploded in cascades of sparks and electrical discharge. The ship began to convulse, its internal systems failing as the control mechanisms were completely severed. Theron ran to Stella and grabbed her hand. Together, they raced back toward the opening that Stella had created. Behind them, the ship began to tear itself apart, the organic material on the walls starting to dissolve and break down. Zephyr and Ember were waiting outside, their heads thrust into the ship's opening. Stella pulled Theron directly toward them, and the dragons began to retreat just as the mothership's final explosion tore through the structure. The remaining 4 motherships, suddenly cut off from their command network, began to malfunction simultaneously. Stella's destruction of the first ship had not been random. Each mothership was connected to the others through a quantum network. Destroying the control center of one effectively crippled all of them. Stella and Theron rode on Zephyr's back as the dragons carried them back toward New Terra. Below them, the Void Eater fleet was in complete disarray, their coordinated assault falling apart as their command structure collapsed entirely. Morgan's voice came through the communication system, filled with wonder and relief. "Whatever you did out there, it worked. They are retreating. The entire fleet is turning away." Stella looked at Theron, who was staring down at New Terra with an expression of hope and disbelief on his face. She had not expected to find another survivor, much less someone from her past. But the universe had surprised her once again. The battle was not yet won, but the tide had turned completely. Humanity and the elves had stood together against impossible odds and emerged victorious. The celebrations that erupted across New Terra were unlike anything the human civilization had ever experienced. The stations lit up with colors and lights as millions of humans gathered to commemorate their victory against the Void Eaters. The battle had lasted only 6 hours, but in that time, the entire trajectory of human history had changed forever. Stella stood in the observation chamber with Theron, watching as the remaining Void Eater ships jumped into hyperspace and disappeared from human space. Behind them, Zephyr and Ember were resting, their massive bodies coiled around each other in a way that suggested contentment and relief. Theron had explained his situation to Stella in detail. The Void Eaters had captured him during the fall of their civilization. They had kept him alive because his genetic structure contained something unique, a natural resistance to their control mechanisms. For 2 years, they had attempted to understand and replicate his immunity, all while using his knowledge to track down and eliminate other survivors of their people. "How many of us are still alive?" Stellar asked. "How many elves survived the initial attacks?" "Based on the signals I was able to send out before my capture, I believe there are approximately 300 of us scattered across different star systems," Theron replied. "Most of them are hiding, terrified of drawing the attention of the Void Eaters. They will not believe that we have actually defeated them unless they see it with their own eyes." Morgan entered the chamber, and the first thing she did was extend her hand to Theron in greeting. It was a beautiful gesture, one that showed complete acceptance and respect. Theron took her hand and inclined his head slightly, understanding the significance of the gesture. "The Council is waiting for both of you," Morgan said. "They want to discuss the future of the Alliance and what comes next." The Council chamber was packed with human leaders from across all of New Terra's territories. Scientists, military commanders, politicians, and administrators all turned to look at Stella and Theron as they entered. The atmosphere was one of cautious optimism, mixed with uncertainty about what the future would hold. An older human named David stood and spoke first. His position was equivalent to a planetary governor, and his word carried significant weight with the other leaders. "We owe you both a tremendous debt," David said, addressing Stella and Theron. "Your knowledge and your willingness to fight alongside us saved our civilization. The question that the Council faces now is how we can ensure that future generations remember this alliance and maintain its strength." Stella stepped forward to address the assembly. Her voice carried through the chamber, and every human present fell silent to listen. "The Void Eaters are not gone," Stella said. "They are weakened, confused, and in retreat. But they will recover. In perhaps 5 or 10 years, they will rebuild their forces and attempt another attack. If we are to survive as a united civilization, we must prepare for that eventuality now." Theron continued where Stella left off. "My people are scattered and afraid, but many of them will come to New Terra if they know that humans have accepted us. We can help you build a stronger defense. We can establish settlements on your outer worlds. We can contribute our knowledge and our skills to building something greater than either of our civilizations could achieve alone." The Council members looked at each other, exchanging glances that suggested they were engaged in some form of silent communication. Finally, Morgan stood. "I propose that we offer full asylum to the elves," Morgan said. "I propose that we establish joint governance structures that give both humans and elves equal say in the defense and administration of our territories. I propose that we create something new, something that has never existed before. A true alliance between 2 different species based on mutual respect and shared purpose." Some of the Council members nodded in agreement immediately. Others looked skeptical or uncertain. But David stood again and added his support to Morgan's proposal. Within moments, a consensus was forming. Over the next 3 weeks, the communication systems of New Terra reached out to all the surviving elves scattered across the galaxy. The message was simple and direct. The Void Eaters had been defeated. Humanity and the elves were forming an alliance. All survivors were invited to come to New Terra and help build something new. The first elves began arriving within a week. They came in small groups in refugee ships and personal vessels, all of them carrying stories of loss and survival. Stella met each new arrival personally, welcoming them back into a community that they thought they had lost forever. Theron worked with the human military to develop new defense strategies that incorporated both human and elf knowledge. The combination of their different perspectives led to innovations that neither species could have developed alone. Weapons became more efficient. Communication systems became more secure. Defensive strategies became more adaptable and resilient. One evening, as Stella walked through the new elf settlements being constructed on the outer edges of New Terra, she encountered a young human officer named Catherine. Catherine had been one of the pilots who had flown alongside Zephyr during the initial battle. "I wanted to thank you," Catherine said. "I would have died in that battle if your dragons had not protected my squadron. I also wanted to ask you something. Is it true that you are considering a position on the ruling council?" Stella smiled. "Morgan and Theron have both suggested this. They believe that both species need representation in decision-making processes. I have not yet decided if I am willing to take on such responsibility." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "I think you should. I think most humans would agree. You have shown us that being different is not the same as being inferior or superior. You have shown us that working together makes us all stronger. That night, Stella sat with Zephyr and Ember, running her hands over their scales in a gesture of pure affection. The dragons rumbled contentedly, their massive heads resting against her body. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The loss and the pain, the fear and the uncertainty, all of it had led here. She had come to New Terra hoping to find allies who would help her fight against an extinction-level threat. Instead, she had found something far more valuable. She had found acceptance. She had found family among humans who were willing to see past their fears and prejudices. She had found a home. The next morning, Stella attended the official council meeting and announced that she would accept a position as the primary liaison between human and elf governance. It was not a position of ultimate authority, but rather one of connection and communication. She would be the bridge between two worlds. Morgan embraced her after the announcement, a gesture that surprised Stella even after weeks of living among humans. It was a fully human expression of joy and solidarity. "You have become one of us," Morgan said quietly, "not in biology but in spirit. That is what truly matters." As Stella looked out at the assembled council members, both human and elf, she felt something that she had not felt in a very long time. She felt hope, not just for the survival of her people, but for a future where cooperation and mutual respect could overcome even the most significant differences between species. The Void Eaters would return someday. But when they did, they would face not just humans or elves, but a unified civilization that was stronger than the sum of its parts. 6 months had passed since the victory against the Void Eaters. The transformation of New Terra had been remarkable to witness. Entire districts of the space station had been restructured to accommodate elf residents. The architecture reflected a blend of human and elf styles, creating something beautiful and unique that represented their newfound alliance. Stella walked through the marketplace where human and elf merchants sold their goods side by side. It was a scene that would have been unimaginable just a year ago. Human traders negotiated with elf craftspeople, discussing prices and quality with the kind of casual ease that suggested they had been doing this for decades rather than months. Theron found her at a small food stand where an elf vendor was selling a traditional dish from their homeland. Stella had not tasted this food in over 2 years. The flavors brought back memories of her childhood, of times before the Void Eaters, before the endless running and fear. "Morgan is looking for you," Theron said, sitting down beside Stella. "There is a diplomatic mission arriving from one of the outer human colonies. They want to establish their own alliance with the elves." Stella finished eating and stood. As she did, she noticed how naturally she moved now through this space. There was no fear in her steps. There was no hesitation or anticipation of rejection. She belonged here. The diplomatic mission consisted of 3 human officials from a colony world called Providence Station. They had heard about the alliance between humans and elves and wanted to establish similar relationships in their own territory. They had brought gifts and proposals, and they had come with open hearts and genuine curiosity. Morgan introduced Stella and Theron to the delegation leaders. One of them, a woman named Lisa, stepped forward with clear enthusiasm. "We have been following the reports of what happened here," Lisa said. "We have watched as your 2 civilizations have not just survived together but thrived. My people want to know if we can learn from your example. Can we benefit from the knowledge that your alliance has produced? Can we build something similar in our own region?" Stella and Theron exchanged a look that conveyed mutual understanding. This was exactly what they had hoped would happen. The successful alliance would inspire other human factions to seek similar partnerships. Over the next 3 days, Stella and Theron worked with the delegation from Providence Station. They explained their governance structures, their military strategies, and most importantly, the cultural exchange programs that had made their alliance so successful. What Stella found most interesting was that the humans from Providence Station were not interested in dominating the elves or controlling them. They were genuinely curious about elf culture and history. They wanted to learn from beings who had survived the fall of entire civilizations and rebuilt themselves. On the 4th day, Lisa asked Stella a question that seemed to come from a place of genuine personal interest. "Do you ever regret coming to New Terra?" Lisa asked. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had gone somewhere else?" Stella considered the question carefully. The truth was that she did sometimes wonder about alternate paths her life could have taken. But those wondering never came with regret. "I came to New Terra hoping to find warriors willing to fight alongside me," Stella replied. "What I found instead was people willing to change. People who were willing to question their own assumptions and accept that they did not have all the answers. That is far more valuable than any army could ever be." The delegation from Providence Station left with a preliminary agreement to establish cultural and military cooperation with the elves. As their ships departed, Morgan and Stella stood together watching them leave. "This is how it begins," Morgan said. "Other human factions will follow. Eventually, the entire human civilization will be connected with elf settlements. The knowledge and strength that flows from cooperation will be impossible to ignore." That evening, Stella received a message that her mother had been found. One of the elf survivors who had recently arrived at New Terra carried information about Stella's family. Her mother had survived the initial attack on their homeland and had been hiding in the outer reaches of the galaxy for years, waiting for a signal that would indicate it was safe to return. Stella made arrangements to travel to a neutral space station where she could meet her mother for the first time in over 2 years. Theron insisted on accompanying her, and Morgan offered the use of one of the fastest ships in the human fleet. The journey took only 3 days. When Stella saw her mother step out of the docking tube, she felt something break inside her that had been holding firm for such a long time. She ran forward and embraced her mother, tears streaming down her face. It was a moment of pure human emotion, something that transcended species and cultures. Stella's mother, whose name was Alara, held her daughter tightly and whispered words in the ancient elf language. Words of love and protection and gratitude that their line had survived. Over the following weeks, Stella's mother and many other elf survivors chose to make New Terra their permanent home. A memorial was established to honor those who had been lost in the war against the Void Eaters. Humans and elves gathered together to pay their respects, demonstrating that grief and loss could create bonds that were just as strong as victory and celebration. 1 year after Stella's first arrival at New Terra, Morgan organized a grand ceremony to officially recognize the alliance between humans and elves. It took place in the largest amphitheater on the station, with thousands of beings from both species gathered together. Morgan and Stella stood side by side as the ceremony began. Morgan spoke about the importance of looking beyond fear and prejudice. Stella spoke about the strength that came from unity and cooperation. And Theron spoke about the hope that came from believing that different species could find common ground. At the conclusion of the ceremony, Stella was asked to step forward. Morgan presented her with a Medal of Honor, the highest recognition that the human civilization could bestow. But more importantly, the ceremony officially recognized her as a full member of the Human Governing Council, with equal vote and authority alongside any human official. As Stella stood holding the medal, she looked out at the assembled crowd. She saw humans and elves standing together, some with their arms around each other. She saw children from both species playing together in the background. She saw a future that was filled with possibility and hope. Zephyr and Ember appeared above the amphitheater, their massive wings beating slowly as they circled overhead. They released a sound that was somewhere between a roar and a song, a sound that seemed to encompass all the emotion and joy of the moment. Later that night, as Stella sat with her mother and Theron and Morgan, they talked about what the future might hold. They discussed plans for expanding the alliance to other human colonies and other surviving elf settlements. They talked about creating universities where human and elf students could learn together. They talked about joint exploration missions to regions of space that neither species had ever ventured into before. But most of all, they talked about the peace that came from knowing that you were not alone. The peace that came from finding people who understood you, who accepted you, and who were willing to fight alongside you against any darkness that might arise. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued around them, Stella found herself thinking about the girl she had been a year ago. That girl had been broken and alone, running from an enemy that could not be stopped. That girl had arrived at New Terra with nothing but fear and desperate hope. Now she was part of something greater. She was part of a civilization that was strong, because it embraced difference rather than fearing it. She was part of a future that promised not just survival but flourishing. And as she looked at the faces of those she had come to care about most, she realized that this was what she had been searching for all along. Not power or weapons or military victories, but a place to belong, a place to call home.